I should. Yeah, so our last speaker of the afternoon is Dr. Steve Niemi. And he's going to be discussing sharing acceptable performance standards.
The risk of being the last speaker of a two-day program is not that you run out of things to say because everybody else has said them, but because people's attention span starts to wane, and I'll do my best to keep you engaged and entertained while we finish up. I first want to congratulate the workshop committee and the attendees here. This is a landmark meeting. This is the first time performance standards have been discussed seriously and in depth. I think we've been resensitized to the opportunities that are possible if we only take the plunge. So I want to start by not repeating but emphasizing a few things that have been said, and also provide more justification perhaps on why this is important. First, the caveats. Whatever I'm going to say is my opinion alone and should not be blamed on any other entity or person. And I have no conflicts to declare otherwise. The course of my remarks will first be to revisit why sharing performance standards is literally vital. And I hope I can make a convincing case that for the future of our health and well-being, and especially future generations, we can't start fast and soon enough in this area. I'll give you more examples of performance standard applications and why those are being considered or have been adopted. And then, per my assignment, propose one framework for sharing performance standards going forward. Being an unrepentant capitalist, I always like to start with the money. So let's talk about where the money comes from to fund this magnificent biomedical discovery enterprise that we have in the US and elsewhere. I've taken figures first from PhRMA, the trade association, PhRMA's website, looking at spending year by year on research and development investment. There was no mention in this graph that these were adjusted dollars, so I presume they're not, because if they're not, the graph looks even better if these are in new dollars every year. But if you do adjust constant to the starting point of 1995, recent trend isn't so encouraging. It's still a pile of money that PhRMA, as a bellwether, is investing in research and development, but it has been flatlined, understandably, starting just before the most recent recession, and it hasn't ticked up again yet. Let's look at NIH, or the US federal government, also one of the two major sources of funding or fuel for this discovery engine. And these are budget trends over the last 5 years, and in case you miss it, this is the one of interest here, a negative trend in funding from the National Institutes of Health. This translates, at least on the academic side, to fewer investigators, whether they are new or experienced, getting money. These are the award success rates over time, starting in 1998. And so whether you are a beginner or a tenured and maybe even chaired faculty member somewhere, the returns on your efforts to write for grant money are getting more depressing. Maybe we have too many scientists. Maybe with ERA and the funding bubble we enjoyed, we have too many folks in the pipeline, and they'll have to figure out through a market correction how they're going to pursue their careers. I think this is the new normal for a while. As a taxpayer, certainly the federal budget is under other pressures. And so how will we accommodate this? That's for later. But in the meantime, I'd like to take performance and engineering standards and conventions and apply some what-if scenarios. So in the fiscal year that just ended, NIH awarded a total of almost $26 billion in extramural grants for research program grants, which are very large collaborative awards, as well as R01 and R01 equivalents, total of over 14,000 awards with an average of 1.8 million per award per year. Off the back of the envelope, with a couple of guesstimates, I've found so far, and this is a preliminary number, that maybe 1 2/3% of an institution's research budget at an academic life sciences enterprise, whether it's a teaching hospital or university, is usually devoted or equivalent to what's spent on animal care at that institution. That includes husbandry, veterinary medicine, management, and training, both for those staff, maybe the next generation of animal care providers, as well as investigators. So if you take 1.67 off of that total award number, now you're looking at $430 million was invested by NIH last year, specifically for animal care. It's also been my observation over the years that up to 30% of what's spent on animal care is unnecessary due to an engineering standard, an engineering practice, a convention. People are doing unnecessary things. So to be conservative and generous, let's back that down to 20%, not 30% that's spent unnecessarily. That translates out of that $430 million up to $86 million or more that could be available for other applications. I am not suggesting, so if you're listening in the NIH central offices or at OMB, that animal care budgets be cut 20%. But if that money could be directed elsewhere, that could be the equivalent of 48 additional awards based on these statistics. Even more depressing are some generational changes that are underway. And this has become a very popular concern lately. If you look at funding by the age of the investigator, back in 1980, the age 35 and younger researcher was much more likely to get awards than investigators who were over 66. Now, maybe some of this is baby boomer demographics, but over time, these graph lines, these curves have reversed themselves. So today, if you are the next generation of scientists, it is, again, pretty daunting of the success rates or the failure rates that you face versus who amongst the older generation is getting more of the pie than your generation or your age demographic used to. And so people are talking now about the grain of academic science or of academic scientists. This may be a little complicated, but if you look to the left of the slide in the faded elements, this is from 1980, looking at the histogram of the age of awardees, either for NIH R01s or medical school faculty. And then if you look at the darker, more bold histograms and curves, that's 2013. And you can see a fairly significant shift in the bulge of funding from what used to be a dominated younger set to now an older set that are taking the lion's share of that money. And so a Harvard faculty member described this to me very well lately, saying we're turning into shakers. In central and western Mass, the shaker community was very robust in the late 19th century up to the mid-20th century. This is a photograph of a barn which is at a museum, I believe in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. It's now a museum because shakers never procreated. They always relied on recruiting new members. They never gave birth to their next generation. So they essentially aged themselves out of existence. So I think that this metaphor is pretty apt in characterizing how serious this could be. So let's take the what if again, looking at the funding from last year. Only 144 new investigator awards were given at an average of about $250,000 a year. I couldn't find the actual figure for fiscal 14, but 250,000 was from fiscal 09. Inflation has been essentially non-existent, so that's close enough. So again, if we take this metric of how much roughly is devoted in NIH money to animal care and applying my conservative 20% of that being unnecessary, if that 86 million could somehow be converted or applied to an equivalent of new investigator awards at the same $250,000 and at a very healthy 60% overhead rate, what's commonly, or I'm told what's average is around 40%. 40% is not going to work in the Boston area. I don't know how it works elsewhere, but things are usually capped at around 60. We're looking at 215 additional award possibilities or investments in the next generation of scientists. So it's this background that enables me to characterize this as of vital importance to us. So let's talk about performance standards and how they can be valued. We can talk about financial relief. If you reduce the expenditures on unnecessary or antiquated or inefficient standards, whether they be engineering or other, you're now liberating more money for science, and if you're in the for-profit sector, certainly for your shareholders. Environmental relief is also an opportunity. We're either consuming less energy to maintain a vivarium, which is a huge energy sinkhole, as they've been engineered today, or we're generating less waste that goes to incinerators into our air or to landfills to eventually pollute something. And then there's also compliance relief. Here's one example of some recent action in this regard. Some of the authors of this paper that came out last spring have been on this program. The Primarica conference that was in Boston last month for the first time ever had a very significant component directed to backing away that more is not always better, and how can we give our customers, our investigators, some kind of break. The asterisk at the top of this actually refers to the next page, but it applies in both contexts. So how to start? And we start in my programs by 4 simple questions. The first one is usually the one that people ask first and only: are we doing things right? Are we doing things by the engineering standards? Are we doing things by what everybody else does? Are we doing things that are done by convention? And they don't go on to the next question, which should be, even if you're doing things right, what would be better? And better I would include as faster, easier, more humane, cheaper, safer, less mistake prone. So as other authors or presenters have stated here, it doesn't have to demonstrate an improvement in animal welfare or occupational safety, but at a minimum has to be welfare or safety neutral. And then it's fair game. Just as importantly, questions 3 and 4, are we doing the right things? And even if we are, how could we do those even better? A simpler version of this is to talk about, are we doing something that's wasteful, that's dangerous, that's error prone, or my favorite word is stupid. So when I meet with our animal care staff or our supervisors and I walk the facilities, I will often ask, show me what we're doing that doesn't make any sense to you. Please, you know a lot better than I do what's going on at cage level, in the operational ebb and flow of the facility. What makes you scratch your head or go home in disgust and figure the guy in the corner office, which is me, is absolutely clueless? Please tell me. And that has led to so many fruitful decisions and investigations and empowerments for people. As was said earlier by Bruce and others, these people know we have a much more educated workforce at this level than we did 30 or 40 years ago. And now we have to make sure that they are recruited, not merely invited, but recruited to participate in these questions. So here's some examples of what are based, if not on engineering standards in the guides, then certainly you have to do it this way because we've done it this way forever. This is one of our animal care technicians, and behind her is an air shower. So when I arrived at Harvard a year and a half ago, we had air showers that were air locks. You had to stand in there and you couldn't leave until 30 seconds later the fans died down, which were there to blow purified air over clean PPE you just took out of the bag and put on. And so what was the value of that? And just if calculating the time spent, the time consumed in those 30 seconds for an average animal care traffic minimum 3 times a day, beginning of the day, back in at lunch, back in after lunch, so on and so forth, that's at least $1,500 a year in labor costs. Now, that may not sound like a big number, but that sends 2 or 3 people to a national meeting. It sends 3 or 4 techs to a regional or a local meeting where there may be an overnighter. This money can go somewhere else. And so we have disabled the air showers. They're no longer used. We had to put a sign up at the door because our investigators had been so well conditioned that you don't have to stop anymore. It's okay to open the door and walk through because they were still waiting for the fans to come on. So let's talk about another. Full PPE, head cover, face mask, gloves, Tyvek jumpsuit, shoe covers. But we're dealing with ventilated cages, laminar flow, purified air, hoods in which to work on those animals, so on and so forth. Picasso once said that good artists copy and great artists steal. I'm happy to say that I just copied. So what we've done is if you are going to be handling rodents or animal contaminated materials, we require you to wear a paper gown and gloves, period. We have copied this from University of Michigan, so here's a photo of a technician that Dr. Disco so generously provided. This is how a person dresses in his dedicated scrubs if he's going to be working in changing cages or otherwise opening cages, handling mice, working throughout the vivarium. Nothing on his head, nothing covering his beard. He has dedicated sleeves and disposable gloves. That's what you spray down with Clydox because that's the only part of you that is sharing the air in that purified environment. No shoe covers. If you're not going to be handling animals or animal contaminated material, then you can walk in dressed as I am, or if Tom Brady, 4-time Super Bowl winner with the New England Patriots, was happening to stop by, he wouldn't have to put on a thing. And so we just started this about a month ago. I also want to mention we've copied this from Dr. David Brammer at University of Houston, and I suspect there are others that I don't know about who are doing this. But the consequences of this is evident in the before and after picture of our PPE donning station. Columbia University veterinarians published a paper in JLAS last summer running the obvious experiment to show that if I use full PPE or if I just use the gloves and gown with proper technique and I work in a virus-laden room with naive animals, those animals stay naive. And they calculated in the paper they would save $150,000 a year converting to reduced PPE based on what we've known for 25 plus years on the security and the reliability of a microisolator. And some of the authors of those peer-reviewed papers are also in this audience. And so how long do we need to go in order to let go? Oops. Give you another example, and this was presented in a public forum, so I didn't have to ask Donna Gerald for permission. This was a project that was presented at the Denver ALAS meeting in 2009, and it was based on when is a cage dirty? That was based on a customer dissatisfaction survey that was sent out, And we got feedback from investigators that the number 2 irritant that they had was cages weren't being changed enough. The number 1 was our prices were too high. That wasn't our decision, so we let that one go. And so a project was launched to incorporate investigators to vote on a series of photographs taken over time of a variety of caging situations and identify by appearance when does a cage looks like it needs to be changed. And ammonia levels were measured and animal welfare was assessed. And so what we discovered at that time were 30% of the cages were being changed prematurely or if they didn't need to be at all. I presented the same project at Filasa in Helsinki in 2010. Somebody from Wellcome Trust in the UK told me that they were onto the same thing and were either moving or already had moved, not by changing by calendar, but by need. Well, if in our environment at the time where we had 27,000 mouse cages, 85% were ventilated, 15 weren't, that 30% reduction in activity translated to the cost of 4 FTE, including fringe benefits per year. It involved over 242,000 cage changes that didn't have to be done when they were normally scheduled, and the mice were disturbed less often. And so I don't know where MGH is in this regard. We're revisiting this now. We had piloted this just before an ALAC site visit where we were changing on spot changing only. And we didn't have all our ducks in a row. ALAC wasn't impressed, so we backed off and went back to 2 weeks. But in the meantime, it has occurred to me, everybody has a standard practice of spot changing before 2 weeks. You walk into a cage, into a room. If a cage looks like it needs changing, the animal care staff are empowered and expected to change that cage. What rigorous scientific criteria have been developed for them to reach that conclusion? To my knowledge, the answer is none. And I'm not suggesting that people now have to come up with rigorous histologically based criteria on when a pre-calendar change needs to be made. But if that's been sufficient over the decades for the regulators and the accreditors, why can't that same judgment call with some reference points to ammonia levels, et cetera, corresponding to the amount of soil bedding, be just as valid after 2 weeks if I've got one male isolated in a cage that may not need changing for 5 weeks? Why isn't that allowed? So let's not get too fancy just because we can do the science that we need to require it. I'll also divulge there are a couple of other institutions, Genentech being one, and I know Rhonda Weiler can give you more details where they have gone to changing not by calendar but by occupancy in those cages. And she's told me that 37% is the inefficiency rate that they discovered earlier before they changed. So there's a lot of opportunity here, I think, for progress. Let me give you some more, and these are not labeled as performance standards. That is premature, but as options. Many programs don't sterilize rodent caging and racks after they've been sanitized. They will only sterilize incoming bedding in most cases. Dr. Littman's program at Memorial Sloan Kettering is probably one of the biggest and most successful and pristine and reliable programs in the country, and this is their practice there. So we have a lot of autoclaves that were purchased and being used, and maybe we don't have to. If you're in the northern climes, during the winter months, the air gets down to 10% relative humidity on the outside. You bring that air inside, and it may not be affordable to condition that air up to the minimum 30% relative humidity that's in the guide. Several years ago at my prior institution, we generated data and had the IACUC allow an exemption because we demonstrated that if the air gets to 20% in the room, the microisolator environment is still at 30% or higher, static or ventilated. So let's make sure we remember what the primary enclosure really is. One institution that I won't identify has told me that they are maintaining their primate rooms, their macaque rooms now at 6 or more air changes an hour. The sky didn't fall, the earth didn't shake. Those animals look fine. I don't know by what criteria they use. A huge energy savings versus the standard engineering default automatic straitjacket of 10 to 12 or 10 to 15 or 12 to 15, however you want to cut it. The next one is one that we're actively pursuing in my program now. When I arrived, any drug used in a protocol that was labeled toxic was handled as a toxic cage, a special label, double glove, the bedding had to be treated separately. And when we got to looking at this more carefully, relearned that this is being used for things like tamoxifen, cyclophosphamide, streptozotocin, that you're injecting in minute quantities into the animal. And there's no evidence that anything excreted from those drugs after it's been metabolized is toxic in the bedding. So the animal is a reliable container. You certainly need to administer these drugs carefully. And if there's a needle stick, that's a whole nother issue. But once the drug is resident in the animal, this should be handled as a routine cage. No additional time, no additional expense. The last one on this list talks about using established human cell lines in xenograft models under animal biosafety level 1 conditions. CDC guidelines state anything human is biosafety level 2. But in my prior employer at the IBC, where I was a voting member at the time, I was pushing for a reality check if those cell lines can be tested for common pathogens of concern, human pathogens, Hep B, Hep C, HIV, and they're handled in a BL1 animal facility, which is equivalent to a BL2 laboratory, and we're taking other precautions. This is not pathologic waste. This is not medical waste. This should be routine waste. If you're handling primary human tissues, biopsies, autopsy specimens, so on and so forth, absolutely, BSL2 is appropriate. So this is another one that we've backed off. You need to have the right equipment, so you can't have edge guard hoods that blow everything right onto you. They've got to be trapped and recirculated, and maybe there are a few other tweaks, but I believe this had been passed after I left. So Donna Gerald can give you more information there. But that was another small victory. Give me some more examples in some other categories. Let's talk about veterinary medicine. We have replaced sentinel rodents with PCR swabs of primarily inanimate surfaces, the exhaust plena of ventilated racks, where all of this stuff gets blown. A year and a half ago at the Baltimore ALAS meeting, Charles River had a very convincing panel session on reminding us of the variabilities and the vulnerabilities of relying on an indirect contact sentinel animal with this little half teaspoon of soil bedding every time you change a cage, things you're not going to pick up, and how this was just as, if not more, reliable on what's currently in your facility. So we have applied this now both to our resident colony and to our incoming imports. We don't use sentinels. We will swab the animals of interest that are coming in. Within 10 business days, we have results from Charles River. If those are negative for our list of excluded pathogens, they go right into the barrier. Kate Pritchett-Corning, who is our senior clinical veterinarian, has in our colony also incorporated some truly random selected experimental animals just as a safety net or for insurance, and we're continuing to evolve our understanding if that's really necessary as well. The price is going to be about the same for the test components, but the fact that we're honoring one of the 3 R's by not using any animals is a nice win. And I haven't calculated yet the labor savings or what we're spending in plastic teaspoons when we're doing the other soil bedding transfer. It was repeated again at the Primer conference last month that you don't have to do annual reviews of non-USDA, non-DOD protocols. Our IACUC has now removed that requirement. We also were reminded at that conference that USDA does not require triennial de novo submissions and thorough reviews like PHS-funded studies do. And so that is now under consideration. So lots of opportunities. So to the assigned topic, how to share and promote performance standards. And here's a couple of musts. They must be evidence-based, and if local IACUC approval is appropriate or required or merited, or local IACUC being informed gets you to the same place, certainly that has to be included. You have to provide the results of your pilot or your trial, plus the materials and methods. The results should include both the data and your statistical tests and your conclusions. But I submit that peer-reviewed publication is not necessary. Sharing this will let the market decide on how much content is required. And now with the bottomless opportunity for online supplements, you can add or embellish or enhance as much information as you wish. So what we need are many examples in at least one public repository. So I didn't take Judy's word of database. Repository to me is more appropriate until I looked up in the dictionary where repository may also mean a catacomb or a burial ground. So that was not my intent here. But some bulletin board of locally adopted options with a caveat, a disclaimer, that just because what we do works for us has been approved by our IACUC, do not take for granted that it is either going to be applicable in your world or meet the regulator or the accreditor standards or be acceptable to them. So we have the knowledge. We have what I hope is even a more urgent justification. What we're lacking in this case is what I'll call courage. Courage to step up, to stand out. That's why I'd like to see such a repository populated by about 500 on day one of these. Keep everybody busy on trying to find the holes while hopefully it will continue to build and we overwhelm the community and the planet with even more and more possibilities. What should this repository include in terms of features? You need a reliable and secure host and server. It should be a website that is easy to use and somehow searchable. So can the searching be done with entries that are by specific categories, maybe by date of entry, maybe by species, maybe by institution, or should there be none at all? It'd be nice to have each entry linked to an applicable element that's in the guide or the Animal Welfare Act or the EU or the UK or the Japanese MHW, whatever works for you. And based on yesterday's guidance from USDA, please post whatever local inspector has allowed you to do at this website, because that's the only way we're ever going to see it. Should this be password restricted access, like an ALAS website, or should it be free and open, like CompMed? If you pass a very minimal filter, then you're allowed in. Just as importantly, I would hope that such a repository would invite suggestions from the public. Let's open this up to crowdsourcing and post some questions. How would you do X? And maybe there's some engineer who in a spare moment has an idea, or an occupational nurse, or someone else who could enrich us with something off the wall and doesn't have the blinders on that we have. How to manage this repository? You need a gatekeeper. You need some person or persons who provide the primary filter to make sure what you're not getting is garbage, either through ignorance or passion. And then I propose there be a more in-depth second filter with a panel of peers who are knowledgeable in the field. And it's not just veterinarians and regulators and occupational safety people, but it could be mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, solar engineers, behaviorists, psychologists, so on and so forth. And their only job would be to make sure that there's nothing obviously missing or nothing obviously wrong. Otherwise, everything should be considered acceptable. Let the market decide. So I'm disagreeing with the full title I was assigned. All performance standards should be acceptable in some context once they fulfill very small requirements. And just as importantly, let's make sure that we include the animal protection community on that panel, not just for public trust. It's not for political goodwill. They certainly have perspectives and sensitivities that we may not have. And I go back to the Animal Welfare Institute and the book they put out a long time ago on comfortable animal quarters. We're almost there now, but decades ago, this was book non grata. And so what else is on their wish list that if they behave as the rest of us should, that they get to participate? And once something is posted, keep the conversation going. Invite commentary. Invite annotations. Those could be similarly filtered. But yes, I'm looking at a Wikipedia model for something like this, and we have talked since the 8th edition came out of making the guide a living document. Is this how we get there? This to me seems as good as any strategy or path of making sure that the guide now is current. And maybe the 8th edition is the last one that needs to go through the exercise that was arduous and lengthy after the 96 edition came out, and we had this long time gap while we were waiting for the guide to catch up. So in terms of launching, the obvious host to me is the ILAR Roundtable, and I'm hoping this appeals to ILAR Roundtable members who have paid in serious cash to join. Here, I would think would be an opportunity for a return on that investment. That if you can save $20,000 or more a year from what is now posted through this vehicle, it would behoove you to consider to continue to support this endeavor. Subscriptions, donations, grants, so on and so forth. This is going to a nonprofit that is going to need not a whole lot of money, but some reasonable resources to continue. If it's not the roundtable, there's a list of usual suspects that come to my mind that could be possible. I've pitched this to at least 2 of these organizations over the last 4 or 5 years and have had no takers yet, but I think it's time that we start moving. So I want to finish with a quote that is on the wall inside the Marine Resource Center at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole by Georgie. Discovery is to see what everybody else has seen and think what nobody else has thought. And with that, I'll thank you for your time. Any questions?
Joe Newsom, Pittsburgh. Steve, really appreciated the talk and the thoughts. One other mechanism for funding, and we joined ILAR and very happy that we have, but I participated in an extramural funded opportunity for like creating a repository for sharing cancer models. Could that format be another way that a repository that's funded by a very important entity like the NIH, in the need for meeting their guidelines, is there enough onus and how would we move that forward would be something to consider, I think, in my opinion.
So are you suggesting federal funding?
Yeah, so there would be a how should I say, a review process for which entity could put the information technology and the management and the review process together that would meet the needs of the community that's using animal models. It might be something that should be considered as well.
I'm all for that, but even though I work in the People's Republic of Massachusetts, government doesn't have to be the first or the last answer. If this can get going in whatever other seed venue, and then look for a grant to enhance, embellish, propel it forward. That's just as good a tactical approach as bootstrapping. Please use the mic.
Can you elaborate a little bit about what you envision the structure of the repository would be like?
The short answer is no, because you would have, I think we already have some examples of format from this conference. Today, yesterday, what various institutions have already done to satisfy their own needs, with another disclaimer that this is not the official format. I would not want to impose one structure fits all, or you have to check every box, or here's the form you have to fill out. I believe that through freedom of submission, we might start to realize things we hadn't thought of originally. So I wouldn't put any kind of formatting imposition on this to begin with, and see what happens. The question is, would it be like a chat room? If somebody has nothing else to do with their free time and wants to manage a chat room and can do it knowledgeably, satisfy yourself. I don't do Twitter, I don't do Facebook, and that's for so many reasons, but I don't know if that would be fruitful. But again, it may.
Well, Steve, I liked a lot of your ideas, and it had me thinking as far as the repository, and of course, we'd have to talk to Lita, but I kind of envision ILAR being front and center on this kind of thing, and also something that was mentioned yesterday about publishing things that don't work, you know, because at least for me, from an animal welfare standpoint, if we can tell people don't do this, then you're not using animals that you shouldn't use. The other thing is that whole issue about the PPE, yeah, coming out of NIH and all. And I really think if you work, or if we worked with like NIEHS and EPA, because there's just so much waste that we're generating and it really hurts the environment. So if people want to do more studies and they're looking for money on that kind of thing, maybe we can talk to those agencies because they have a purchase in this as well.
Bob Disco, University of Michigan. I'd like to talk about 2 points. The first is, you know, Steve talked about reducing PPE and used us as an example, and you didn't have to do that, but thank you. An interesting thing, though, is we're starting to get a little blowback on that because we are not protecting our staff members from developing allergens or allergies, okay? Because we don't have them wearing face masks and we don't have them. And so now we're going to be sort of, I'm seeing us being thrown into another performance standard where we're no longer evaluating whether it's safe to wear just that PPE for the animals, but also is it still safe for the people to do that? And I just wanted to raise that out there. I'm still in favor of reducing PPE, but I'm just saying that in the wind, we're getting some kickback on that. Yes, we're using hoods, all vertical hoods everywhere, yes. The other piece that I've gotten some brushback on is the comment you made regarding USDA, DOD being a little bit different from everything else, and therefore you segment your program such that certain things only happen in those cases. And I was given advice that segments your program out and makes your program look like it's tiered. And why would the wild mus musculus be treated any differently from the laboratory mus musculus? And therefore, you should not use those types of regulatory groups or funding agencies as a reason for how you do things in your program. I understand the rationale for reasoning. I get that, but I was just curious, and this is not only just to you, but to everybody else, if anybody else has sort of heard that as a philosophy, embraces that as a philosophy, and if we wanted to have a discussion on that, because to me, that's an area where we could have some very quick performance standard type of wins in reducing things by doing that tiering, but yet I'm hearing that other people feel that's not the way to run a program.
So let me respond to both of those excellent points. First, with regards to reduced PPE, we vetted this with our biosafety officer, our environmental health and safety office, and our occupational health physician, and they were on board with it. The other reality check that I want to remember is the masks that we were using. Everybody agreed that they were useless. The analogy that was given by Kate Pritchett Corning was the only thing they're good for is so you don't sneeze in the salad bar. But beyond that, there was really no protection afforded to whatever is floating through the room. And so that gave us more confidence that people who were pre-screened for or self-report for symptoms that are animal allergy related are fitted with N95s, go through an annual refit. So it's a streamlined, but it's not a casual environment. And this is a work in progress. So if somebody else does this and sees a verified uptick in new allergies or allergy symptoms that worsen, then I think we all revisit it. But if we do, given the lack of reliability of what we all used to wear, I'd be very curious as to what has changed. With regards to bifurcating or now having a variegated approach to review, nothing says that you have to treat your annual review as simple as people do, or as allegedly simple. I'm speaking to USDA in the room. It's still a very thorough review, but it is often a fast track while people do the real review, quote unquote, every 3 years. Why can't that annual review be more in-depth and challenging, but still not to the level of what you require? Or can you streamline your protocol form and your process so you relieve burdens on both counts? And is there an answer there? Both questions you raise would be fantastic in the conversation notes on somebody posting each of these in a repository with strings of conversations continuing that I think would be informative to everybody.
Bruce Kennedy, Cal Poly Pomona. Steve, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm hearing a little bit of an emphasis on engineering standards in terms of, say, ammonia control or wetness of a cage, and looking at a cage and the activity that's in there, not looking at that cage nearly so often. Seems like there's a little bit more technology going on there. Given the acceptance or adoption of change, moving towards technology and away from the person that's supposed to be looking at the cage, observing whatever that environment is there an issue there? Do we have the equipment, the technology in order to do these kinds of things right now and adopt those as engineering standards as compared to a performance standard? I'm particularly interested in the ammonia level because you and Rhonda were speaking.
Sure. With regards to ammonia, it's difficult to measure ammonia reliably, and I'll defer to Dr. Weiler for their expertise on that. And it's even more difficult to place a threshold when ammonia magically below a line is okay and above a line is deleterious. So we have that to get through. I don't think it's an engineering standard so much as now an engineering tool. Right now we have a once a day requirement. Every animal should be observed. We've learned not to disturb rodents in a shoebox cage in a rack because then that's an earthquake they undergo every day, so we just look at them. If we've got lots of environmental enrichment materials in there, it's hard, if not impossible, to evaluate every animal thoroughly every day. So I envision a day where there will be smart cages, and there are some cage manufacturers who already have some first generation technology available now. Others are working on it, that will monitor the cage for things that you want to know about for you 24/7, and will set alarms when things go out in and out of spec. Activity. If there's too much activity in a cage at 3 in the morning, Does that mean mice are just active because they're nocturnal, or is there fighting? And can you put an ultrasonic sensor in there as well? So maybe you can pick up some more evidence of angry rather than happy mice. Or if you're looking at activity that's below an acceptable level, are those mice now moribund or dead, no matter what time of day? When that technology comes, we will have a performance expectation that anytime you get that alarm, you're now obligated to respond. So who's on night call to go in and check? We can put in moisture meters and look at flooded cages much more reliably than we do now. And who's going to be there? Because now we know, now we can't wait in our ignorance for that 5-second peak during the morning day room check that we have to respond. So I see those technologies enabling better performance outcomes than what we have now.
Hi, Steve. First of all, thank you. I think, first of all, Neil Lippman. And I want to, first of all, thank you. These are thought-provoking. On some concepts, I completely agree. On others, I think there needs to be debate and discussion. But I just want to make 2 points about PPE. So PPE, as my esteemed colleague Bob mentioned, is for 2 reasons. It's for biosecurity, and it's also for personal protection. There is a study, it's a very nice study out of Europe, in which it was shown that rodent allergens were collected in people's hair. And it's not only the person themselves, but they were able to track it back to the person's home, into their bedding and other things. So I think we have to be very careful about what we do, and it has to be very well thought out. And I think one of the aims, and it is sort of like a performance standard from the standpoint, when you do things in your program, you need to understand why you're doing something. And that's a very important question to ask. The other thing I just wanted to point out and make sure people understand is that these change stations we use are primarily to provide personnel protection. They're not a biosafety cabinet. And many times we're actually blowing this material out. So we're also, again, from the standpoint of personal protection, and not only the person themselves, but the person in the office that they return to, or the laboratory, and their children and their wife. I think we have to do these things very deliberately and very carefully. And people really have to think these things well, think them out well. But I do think most of the points you make are well worth discussion, and perhaps for a further workshop to analyze individual things in more detail and look at the pros and the cons of each one.
Points well taken. And again, if we had a repository, this would be a very useful dialogue. We're having an active conversation with our environmental health and safety people on risk assessment and risk management. So, and I don't want to belittle the point of finding rodent allergens on my body when I go home, and potentially exposing my family to risk to allergies. But are there also data to show what is the threshold of hazardous levels of what you're carrying versus what you carry at all? And I don't know. But is there, if I bring home a little, whatever that number is, then is it innocuous? If I bring home a lot, how do I get a lot on my head? What am I doing that I'm not supposed to be doing? And for our people who are working in cage wash, on the dirty side, they wear a whole lot more than just what I portrayed working in the vivarium. So I want to make that clear as well. These are nuances and details that absolutely have to have further conversation globally and in a public forum. Appreciate that.
Hi, Donna Gerald from Mass General. I was trying to say, don't say anything, Donna. But I did want to highlight a couple of things.
That'll be a first.
I know. And I didn't make it, so I'll try next time. I go back, and we've said this over and over again, and I'll emphasize, if you were to talk with the people doing the work and asking them where do they see opportunity, you will get and where are the risks. Our staff did not like disturbing cages that were clean. And they were very excited to participate in the study to actually do spot changing. Our biggest challenge is to move to a 7-day work force to have that consistent spot changing. And we do have a couple of facilities that are pursuing that, and we are benefiting from the reduce. It's not just people are not looking at the cages, they're looking at the cages every single day, but the work to remove that cage, move it to the cage washer, dump all of the waste that goes, and the disturbance to the animal. So I think, and we've also looked at things like removing just the shoe covers. So if we can't take off all the PPE, what's the wasted PPE? Our staff said that the only reason that we really wear shoe covers is to keep the floors clean. So you start to weigh out some of that. It's going to be incremental. There are going to be some big wins. There are going to be some small wins. But the staff can tell you where if they could redirect their time to things that directly benefited the welfare of the animals and not just did something because the regulations told them to, I think that we would be moving in the right direction. And I support the repository. I'm looking forward to seeing more discussion about that.
John Bradfield made a very important point yesterday I want to reemphasize with regards to our pilot experiment at Harvard on discarding the calendar and changing cages by need only. And he said that when you run the pilot or the trial, often you will learn something that wasn't obvious when you started, regardless of your hypothesis. What we learned is that our staff were not comfortable not taking those animals out once every 2 weeks or more often, handling them, giving them a chance to examine the animals when they put them in their new cage. So they were concerned that we were missing things that we couldn't see in the 13 days earlier. And so that was another reality check and morale recognition for us to go back to once every 2 weeks or more frequently until we figure this out. I envision a day, though, per Bruce's earlier question, that technology is going to augment, if not replace, a lot of what we do now so that the animal's environment and those animals could be assessed more accurately, more quantitatively, 24/7 without a human intervention. And then how do we manage that? And that's not going to happen immediately, but I anticipate that coming someday soon. Okay.
So, Steve, thanks very much for great presentation. Steve, before you go, I've got a question for you. Okay.
Didn't see you over there, Judy.
First of all, thank you very much. That isn't what I meant. Well, that is, you're entirely online with me. I didn't want a database that takes hours and hours for maintenance. That's exactly the sort of thing I think would be a useful way forward. And what I'd like to do is to encourage you thinking about that on an international scale, because the problems you've got here and the issues you're addressing here in the US are very, very similar to those we're addressing in Europe, and indeed are being addressed in other parts of the world, China, South America, and so on. So the more we can think of this as an international initiative, the more that opens the way for international collaborations between scientists in different countries. And I think, in terms of efficiency of science and science advancement, that has to be really important. As a regulator, I would argue that this is not the sort of thing that a regulator should manage. Because the problem with being a regulator is that you actually have to define the blacks and whites of things. And what you're talking about here is a community type of driven thing. So I'm not trying to cop out of it. It's just, for me, it doesn't feel like the sort of thing that I or my fellow regulators in other countries should be leading on, although I think that there's a role for us to support and facilitate and help and give our overt support for this sort of initiative. I think as far as ILAR is concerned, I haven't had a chance to speak to Leader about this yet, but it does seem, thinking about the international piece, that since ILAR is an OIE collaborating center, it fits very well into that model. And so I would definitely support the idea of ILAR giving some leadership in this, particularly on the back of this workshop. And I guess my question is, how do you get this started? What's the next move? What have you got a roadmap that we can sort of start down? What do you think?
Well, first, let me thank you for bringing up the international flavor. I didn't know how much time I was going to have, so I didn't have a slide on another aspiration that this would be translated into Mandarin, into Portuguese, into Spanish, into Japanese, Korean, even into British. So we'd be able to understand it globally. And if for no other reason, people from developing countries take lessons from us as if we are knowledgeable and current. We may be knowledgeable, but my advice has always been, please don't follow everything we do. A, because you can't afford it, and B, you shouldn't be wasting precious money on a lot of these things because they're no longer necessary. And when I've walked into brand new life science research centers in Asia, in South America, fitted with the latest technology, ventilated racks and rack washers, everything else, and very few people have a clue how to manage those, or they're taking their direction from practices we implemented 30, 40 years ago. So I would hope that this would be an enabling and liberating catalyst as well. In terms of how to get started, I haven't given it any more thought than what I've outlined here. And I would leave it to much smarter people and maybe a few techies who are probably not even 18 or 19 years old yet to get this started. But I don't think it's going to be hard. And maybe there is a draft phase where you are soliciting things and then one day you go live and you're populated with 300, 400 solutions, and now people can start to window shop. And that'd be a great thing. But we're all well-versed on how to write in the scientific method. These need to be experiments of a sort with the classical elements of experimental design and description. So it's not like we have to learn a foreign language. But that's as far as I've gotten.
So the way I kind of do it today when I'm looking for performance standards is I go to the CompMed archives and see what people are doing, see if they have similar questions. And if I want something more updated, I'll blurt out a message, hey, we're doing this, what are you guys doing? So it's kind of one of the ways I get a feel for what the current standards are. So I think that's a critical part, is to have, and somebody else mentioned sort of a blog. I don't know if you need a real-time blog, but these are performance standards, so they're subject to scrutiny and disagreement. So I think an important component of that is to have some type of a discussion, perhaps even link it to CompMed in some way. When a new performance standard gets entered in this database, maybe put out a blurb on CompMed, hey, take a look at this, so that we can generate that type of dialogue and discussion.
I think a bridge to CompMed would be terrific. I didn't want to mention that because I didn't want to give Ken Boschert a heart attack because he's pretty much a one-man operation. But all of the discussion and commentary that happens on CompMed is certainly fair game here, and you wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. Again, thinking out loud, can you merely connect to a search engine that would extract what is already in the CompMed archives? So maybe it's old news and you've got a variety of opinions. That'd be just as good a start as any. But to organize it with maybe a little different purpose than what CompMed is for. Okay. Thanks again.